This video is going to be about 3 other historical figures that were present in Lovecraft's route, mainly the ones that were put into some kind of government position by Lovecraft. Frank Belknap Long was born in Manhattan, New York City on April 27, 1901, and he grew up in the Harlem area of Manhattan. His father was a hunter and fisher, so they usually went on annual summer vacations from when he was 6 months old to when he was 17, with these vacations usually being in the Thousand Islands region of the Canadian shore. On one of these vacations when he was 3, he fell off a pier into the river and caught pneumonia. Since he lived in New York City his whole life, he was educated in the NYC public school system. He was fascinated by natural history and dreamed about running away to explore the rainforests of the Amazon. His interest in the weird came about by reading the Wizard of Oz books and by reading the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Ambrose Bierce, H.G. Wells, and Jules Verne. In his late teens, he was active in the United Amateur Press Association, UAPA. While there, he won a prize from the Boys' World around the year 1919, and that's how he found amateur journalism. His first published tale was published in March 1920, and it was called Dr. Whitlock's Price. Then in 1921, his story The Eye Above the Mantle caught the eye of H.P. Lovecraft. This sparked a friendship and correspondence between the two until Lovecraft died in 1937. He went to New York University from 1920 to 1921, where he studied journalism, though he later transferred to Columbia. In 1921, he suffered from appendicitis, which caused his appendix to rupture, and he got peritonitis. He was in New York's Roosevelt Hospital for a month, where he came close to dying. This near-death experience caused him to decide to leave college and become a freelance writer. So in 1924, he sold his first short story, The Desert Lich, to the Weird Tales magazine. Though the next 40 years, he was a frequent contributor to pulp magazines like Weird Tales and Astounding Science Fiction, though he also published many non-fiction articles as well. His first book, A Man from Genoa and Other Poems, was published by W. Paul Cook in 1926. The poems in this book were praised by a great variety of writers. Besides Lovecraft, his closest friends were Samuel Luffman, H. Warner Munn, and James F. Morton, though he also had several encounters with Hart Crane since he lived in the flight above Luffman. In 1931, his story The Horror from the Hills, as Lovecraft and others related to him, it incorporated almost verbatim a dream. In the late 1930s, he started writing science fiction for Astounding Science Fiction, as well as contributing horror stories to Unknown, which later became known as Unknown Worlds. He contributed an episode along with C. L. Moore, Robert E. Howard, and H. P. Lovecraft to the story, The Challenge from Beyond, in 1935. Also, in 1935, his second book, The Goblin Tower, was jointly published by H. P. Lovecraft and Robert H. Barlow under the Dragonfly Press imprint. In the 1940s, he would write for pulp magazines like Thrilling Wonder Stories and Startling Stories, sometimes writing under the pseudonym Leslie Northern. He also said a minor disability kept him from fighting in World War II, and that kept him writing full-time in the early 1940s. He also ghost-wrote 2 or 3 of the Ellery Queen Jr. novels, but didn't say which. It's speculated they were The Golden Eagle Mystery, 1942, and The Green Turtle Mystery, 1944. The third one was never published, but it may have been The Mystery of the Golden Butterfly. In the 1940s, he also wrote comic books, which included horror stories or adventures into the unknown. He made scripts for Planet Comics, Superman, Congo Bill, DC's Golden Age Green Lantern, and the Fawcett Comics Captain Marvel. He also worked as a script reader for 20th Century Fox. He eventually also started writing crime and weird menace stories for magazines like 10 Gang Mystery. He also lived in California for a long period in the 1940s. Long then met Theodore Sturgeon several times in the mid-1940s. Long credited Sturgeon for helping get his story A Guest in the House produced on CBS TV in 1954. In 1946, his first collection of supernatural fiction, called The Hounds of $10, was published by Arkham House. In the 1950s, he was involved with editing 5 different magazines, such as the Saint Mystery Magazine and Fantastic Universe. For Satellite Science Fiction, he was associate editor in 1959 for short stories from 1959 to 1960, and also on Mike Shane Mystery Magazine until 1966. After pulp magazines started declining, he moved into producing science fiction and gothic romance novels in the 1960s and 1970s. He even wrote a story called The Electronic Frankenstein Affair under the pen name Robert Hart Davis for the Man from U.N.C.L.E. magazine. In 1960, he got married to Lida Arco, who was an artist representative and aficionado of drama. They were married until Long died in 1994, and they had no children. Also, Long considered himself an agnostic, and in referring to Lovecraft, he said he shared their skepticism concerning supernatural occurrences / the occult. In 1963, Arkham House published his novel, The Horror from the Hills, which partly incorporated a dream Lovecraft had experienced and told Long about. In 1972, another collection of his works was published by Arkham House and was called The Ring of the Unknown. He also wrote 9 modern Gothic novels, starting with So Dark a Heritage in 1966. 8 of these were published under the name Belknap Long, and 7 appeared during the 1970s. They were only intended to support him and his wife instead of being high-quality works. He also wrote a book-length memoir about Lovecraft, called Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Dreamer on the Night Side, and it was issued by Arkham House in 1975. He hastily wrote it after he read Lovecraft, the biography, by L. Sprague de Camp, which was published in 1975. He thought it was biased against Lovecraft, so he wrote his own memoir about him. He won the first Fandom Hall of Fame award in 1977, and the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement at the 1978 Fourth World Fantasy Convention. After 1977, his literary output slowed, though he published several scattered stories in the 1980s. This included the story chapbook in Reversal Night in 1981, and one episode in the Round Robin sequence Gorkin Slayer in 1997. He and his wife were living in extreme poverty in an apartment in Chelsea, Manhattan during the 1980s and 1990s. In 1987, he was awarded the Bram Stoker Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Horror Writers Association. Even though he was confined to a wheelchair, he was a guest of honor at the H.P. Lovecraft Centennial Conference in Providence, Rhode Island in 1990. While there, he spoke on panels about his memories about Lovecraft, who was his friend and literary mentor. On January 3, 1994, he died of pneumonia at St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Center in Manhattan when he was 92 years old. Due to his poverty, he was interred in a potter's field for indigents. However, friends and colleagues of his had his remains moved and reinterred at the Woodlawn Cemetery in New York City, in a family plot near Lovecraft's grandparents. There was a graveside ceremony on November 3, 1995, and on November 17, 1995, the actual interment took place. Fans of his contributed over $3,000 to have his name engraved on the central shaft of his burial plot. His wife died shortly after him, and their ashes were scattered on his grave. Robert Haywood Barlow, or more commonly known as R.H. Barlow, was born on May 18, 1918 to Lieutenant Colonel Everett Darius Barlow and Bernice Barlow. When he was born, his father was serving with the American forces over in France. Much of Barlow's youth was spent at Fort Benning, Georgia, since that's where his father was stationed, but they moved from army post to army post. He didn't receive much formal education because of this, but he was a brilliant youth and pursued education on his own. Around 1932, Colonel Barlow received a medical discharge and retired on disability from the Army. Colonel Barlow, his wife, and his son settled in a small town called Delaware, which is in Florida, and he built a lakeside homestead for them. In 1934, family difficulties forced him to move to Washington, D.C., and while there he received treatment for his overstrained eyes at an Army facility, since he was the son of a retired Army officer. He returned to Delaware in 1935 and received training at the Kansas City Art Institute, where Thomas Hart Benton is one of his teachers. After that, he received training at San Francisco Junior College. He then lived with the Beck family for a time in Lakeport, California. While there, he helped publish H.P. Lovecraft's Commonplace book and several other works in Beck's Feudal Press. Also, for Lakeport was mailed the second and final issue of his amateur magazine Leaves, which he and Lovecraft planned together before Lovecraft died. He had been friends with H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard since he was 13. Lovecraft visited Barlow and his family at their home in Florida, where Barlow helped Lovecraft on 6 of his stories: The Slaying of the Monster, 1933, The Horde of the Lizard Beast, 1933, The Spoof, The Battle That Ended the Century, 1934, Till of the Seas, 1935, An Unfinished Parody, Collapsing Cosmoses, 1935, and The Night Ocean, 1936. When Lovecraft died, Barlow received a telegram from Lovecraft's aunt, Annie Gamwell, but he went to Providence immediately. For Lovecraft's instructions in case of decease, he appointed Barlow as his literary executor. After Barbara Meyer, a friend and counselor of his, suggested that he makes the study of Mexico's antiquities his goal, he went to Mexico from 1940 to 1941. While there, he studied at Escuela Nacional de Ciencias Biológicas, and when he returned to California, he received a B.A. degree at the University of California in 1942. He then returned to Mexico as a permanent resident and started working at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Then in 1944, he received the Rockefeller Foundation and in 1946 to 1948 he received the Guggenheim Fellowship. He then became the head of the Department of Anthropology at the Mexico City College, which he held until he passed away in 1951. When it comes to Barlow's death, he had written in 1944 that he had a subtle feeling that my curious and uneasy life is not destined to prolong itself. He killed himself on either January 1st or 2nd, 1951, at his home at Azcapotzalco, DF, Mexico. It was said he did this because he apparently feared that his homosexuality would be exposed by a disgruntled student of his. On that afternoon, he locked himself in his room with Mayan pictographs on the door saying, "Do not disturb me, I want to sleep a long time." He proceeded to take 26 capsules of Seconal, which back then was used as a sedative, but is now considered obsolete. August William Derleth was born on February 24th, 1909 to William Julius Derleth and Rose Louise Volk. He grew up in Sauk City, Wisconsin, and his education was at a local parochial and a public high school. He wrote his first piece of fiction when he was 13, and was most interested in the reading, to the point that he went to the library 3 times a week. Any money he had was saved for books, and later on in his life his personal library had more than 12,000 books. He had many influences, such as Edgar Allan Poe, Walter Scott, Henry David Thoreau, Alexander Dumas, Samuel Johnson, H.L. Mencken, Walt Whitman, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. After having 40 rejected stories, he sold his first story, Bat's Belfry, to the Weird Tales magazine, with it being published in the May 1926 issue. He still wrote through his 4 years at the University of Wisconsin, where he got his B.A. in 1930. He also briefly served as the associate editor for the Mystic magazine during this time. In the summer of 1931, he returned to Sauk City and worked in a local canning factory. He also collaborated with his childhood friend Mark Scorer. They rented a cabin and would write gothic and other horror stories to sell to Weird Tales magazine. Derleth eventually won a prize on the O'Brien Roll of Honor for Five Alone, which was originally published in Pagan 8 magazine. For his work on the Sac Prairie saga, he was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, with his sponsors being Helen C. White, Sinclair Lewis, and Edgar Lee Masters. Then in the mid-1930s, he organized a Rangers Club, served as clerk and president on the local school board, served as a parole officer, organized a local men's club, and a parent-teacher association. He was a contributing editor of Outdoors magazine and lectured in American regional literature at the University of Wisconsin. With his longtime friend Donald Wandre, in 1939 they founded Arkham House with the objective of publishing H.P. Lovecraft's works, as Derleth has corresponded with Lovecraft since he was a teenager. When Lovecraft would write about Le Comte de Erlet, it was in homage to Derleth. Derleth was also the one to come up with the term Cthulhu mythos to describe the fictional universe Lovecraft and others in his circle wrote about. After Lovecraft passed away, he wrote many stories based on notes and fragments that Lovecraft left behind. He would call himself a posthumous collaborator and publish them under the tagline H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. At the same time as this, he began teaching an American regional literature course at the University of Wisconsin. Then in 1941, he became the literary editor of the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin, until he resigned in 1960. Some of his hobbies included philately, chess, swimming, fencing, and comic strips. He used the funding from his Guggenheim Fellowship to bind his comic book collection instead of traveling abroad as the award intended. His true hobby, however, was hiking the lands of Wisconsin and observing and recording nature. In 1948, at the 6th World Science Fiction Convention in Toronto, he was elected president of the Associated Fantasy Publishers. Then on April 6, 1953, he was married to Sandra Evelyn Winters. They had 2 children, April Rose and Walden William, which Derleth retained custody of as they divorced 6 years after being married. April went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1977. She also became the president, CEO, and major stockholder of Arkham House in 1994. She remained in those positions until she eventually died on March 21, 2011. She was known as a naturalist and a humanitarian. In 1960, Derleth began to edit and publish a magazine called Hawk and Whippoorwill. It was dedicated to poems of man and nature. On July 4, 1971, Derleth died from a heart attack and was buried in the St. Aloysius Cemetery in Sauk City. The US 12 bridge over the Wisconsin River is named in his honor.